Yeah, we're live. Hello and welcome to the fourth edition of the Micro Frontends Meetup. I'm your host, Florian Rappel. Welcome to the show. So, before we get started, you know already the drill. Like every time, we have to go through, some bureaucratic stuff, but it's important to know why you're here and what the general rules are. So let's walk over them very briefly. As you know, this session is being streamed live on YouTube or LinkedIn. We will also record that and have the recording being made available on YouTube. Therefore, everything that is spoken in the chat, questions that we get, will be presented also in the recording. If you don't like that your handle or name is shown there and your message, just write us your message in another way, for instance, via LinkedIn message or on Twitter or wherever you like, via email, and we will handle that, of course, with greater care. Otherwise, of course, you're welcome to use the public chat functionality. With the chat, of course, there are also some responsibilities. Therefore, please be polite in the chat. Don't harass anyone. Follow our code of conduct. It's really important that everyone is just nice towards each other and that problems are being solved differently, right? So always, just act as a fellow human being. I think if you follow that rule, we are all in a good spot. Then, as usual, if you know someone you want to have on the show, if you want to be in the show yourself, just write us. We're always looking for inspirations. Who do get next? Always just a message. You can just ping me, for instance, on the LinkedIn profile, for instance, connect to me and tell me your thoughts. Also, of course, if there are some topics you would like to see covered, just write us and we will also try to bring them into the show. So always just be engaging. Tell us what went good, what could be better, and what you want to see here, and we will try to make this happen. Finally, some announcements. First announcement, State of Micro Frontends survey. Finally, it's done. Results are available, so the page is still there, because if you now log into the page with your GitHub account, you should be able to browse through the results. They will also be presented in more detail in the next Micro Frontends Meetup. So already mark your calendar for the November edition. I don't know the date by heart, but I think it will be the 16th. But anyway, the Thursday that's always in the middle of the month. So we will go over these results, and we will even have more results because we will also have Manfred Steyer from Austria here in the show. He conducted or is currently conducting a similar survey. URL is on my LinkedIn page. I just posted this. Otherwise, just go to Manfred's Twitter, for instance. He also shared the URL there, and you can greatly help Manfred if you also participate in that survey. And he will share the results in the November meetup too. So in November, we will really go all over the state of Micro Frontends, and I think it will be quite interesting. All right, and final advertisement as usual. We still have our workshops ongoing. I think the last one that was scheduled for here is already sold out, so sorry for that, but you can still see what we have, and we will try to schedule new ones since they seem to be quite popular. And in any case, you can see the agendas there if you're interested in general in a workshop. So enough advertisements. Let's get into the show. And first guest I like to have on the stage is Sandra. Hi, Sandra. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm also fine. Thanks, and thanks for being part of the show. So Sandra is a front-end engineer at JP Morgan Chase, and why don't you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So I like to think that I'm more part of the Chase than JP Morgan because I am one of the developers on the Chase UK app. I've been with Chase since the very beginning, pretty much. So over 4 years at the moment, and I am the design system lead, and I also lead the front-end architecture council in our company.
Nice. Great. And you will talk about Micro Frontends today and the journey that you took with, I think, the UK app, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, that will be quite interesting. But we have also a second guest, so let's welcome Philip on the stage. Hi.
Hello, I'm Philip. Yeah, I'm a consultant at Netlight. When I'm not at Netlight, I am trying to perfect my audio setup. Yeah, apart from that, I'm earning my money since at least 10 years now with writing software. And
Awesome.
the last 3 years I've been with Netlight, and also the last 3 or 4 years I've been mainly doing React development. And yes, I'm going to be talking about what we've done at my current client to improve their setup.
Awesome. That will be quite interesting. Is the name of the client disclosed, or because I think it was in the?
No, it's not disclosed. I'm going to tell you about it later.
Okay.
I'm going to
Okay.
give you
All
a
right.
introduction in a second.
Great. Okay. Cool. Then I would say, Sandra, let's dive right into the app from the UK app of Chase, right?
Yes. So, hello everybody. As Florian previously said, I'm going to be talking about how we do the micro frontends in the Chase UK, or maybe even how we arrived at the micro frontends in Chase UK. So, first of all, I think that not all of you are familiar with Chase and what it is in general. So we are the first non-challenger mobile-only bank in the UK. We don't have any spot in any location, and we do everything online. We've gathered over 1.6 million users, and we have only been live for 2 years. So you can do the math. We've been in the state of getting ready for over 2 years as well. We are one of the fastest growing banks in Europe, and we've already won multiple awards. But most importantly is we started as a greenfield project, which means that we have written everything from the scratch, and we didn't try to use any older technology available in the firm. So starting from there, when I said that we built everything from scratch, we built everything in React Native. So there are multiple reasons why we chose React Native. One of them obviously being write once, but use everywhere. But the truth about React Native applications is if you are going to use the standard boilerplate, what you're going to end up with is a catalog for iOS, one for Android, and then just a bunch of files that don't really belong anywhere. So speaking of React Native, a lot of people who come to React Native as developers usually start as React developers. So coming from the web background, it is a little bit tempting to start organizing everything into flows, screens, hooks, or helpers, but it's not necessarily always helpful. So given that the code base, while it's growing, is getting a little bit messy, or should I say very messy, micro frontends are actually one of the best solutions that you could come up with. So in terms of how we benefited from micro frontends, well, most importantly, we finally gave the autonomy. Well, we made the teams autonomous. So everybody knows what they're working on. Everybody clearly knows their area and their responsibilities. We also got the shorted build time, because if you can cache some of the packages, then obviously you will work only on the ones that you've changed. We've got a much more flexible and manageable CI/CD infrastructure, and I'll speak about it a little bit more in detail later. But then we also get the isolated defects that are very easy to navigate to. We get the independent testing for all of the packages, and also independent release. And I am also going to touch on this a little bit later. So a pretty standard setup for a React Native application is, yes, ignoring the iOS and Android because I'm a React Native developer, is a couple of catalogs. First one being responsible for apps, and second one for packages. So you'll see later that in apps, what we have is, in our current situation, we have the apps that are responsible for different features inside of the application. Now, in terms of packages, we ended up initially in exactly the same situation as we did in the beginning. We essentially moved the bunch of files that we had outside of everywhere, put them in packages, and tried to organize them in folders. So we also ended up with like components, flows, helpers, hooks, etc. Well, needless to say, that did not work for us. So now the number one public enemy of shared packages, cyclic dependencies. So I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with what cyclic dependencies are, but essentially cyclic dependencies are dependencies between two or more packages that can be direct or non-direct, but essentially make make two packages or more to depend on each other. Now, why it's so important to not have cyclic dependencies? Well, while we have the cycles, they introduce the unpredictability to the build. So we might end up resetting some values or overwriting some values, or even have like an extremely long building and testing time that is not actually going to end. It's just going to eventually crash. And we also get the impossible to debug white screen of death. So a little anecdote. I remember when I used to work on one of the packages where we left a comment that we should not try to sort the exports alphabetically, because once we do that, everything is going to break. And well, it was true. Once I tried to sort it, that's the situation I ran into, the beautiful white screen. Needless to say, it was time to do something about it. So what we've done, there are two main ways of removing cyclic dependencies. First one is quite easy, because when we have the direct dependencies between packages, we can just try to move one utility to another package and everything is fine. But when we go into the indirect dependencies, it gets a little bit trickier. So in that case, the easiest way to resolve it is taking the offender and just create a new package where it's going to sit. So in that way, we just break the cycle. Now, we, following that way, ended up with over 85 shared packages. So it's not necessarily great. And let me show you why. So imagine that we have a package called call helpers. We've got shared helpers, shared components, and shared hooks depending on it. Now, when we are going to make a change in core helpers, we will have to release the shared components, shared hooks, and shared helpers. It doesn't seem like much because it's only 4 packages. But what do we do if the dependency tree looks like this? That's becoming a little bit more of a problem. Actually, it just kills the purpose of micro frontends, because eventually we are going to end up releasing pretty much every package anyways. Now, how we approach this problem is we decided to follow the principles of feature-driven design, or maybe even to narrow it down, the product feature-driven design. So what is feature-driven design? It's essentially an agile methodology where when we want to build a product, first we develop its model. We list out all the features that are going to be in it, small features, not big features like the ones that I will be talking about. We then plan every single feature separately. We design every single feature separately, and we build every single feature separately and test on the way as well. So doing it that way, we end up with autonomous feature directories, which can work independently, but also have loose dependencies between each other. So I know that you might not be familiar with the app. So a few screenshots. We have the accounts feature on the yellow screen, the payments feature, the payments hub on the red screen, or the servicing on the orange. Or again, insights on the orange, rewards on the red, and cards on the yellow. Now, why do I mention this? Because now, looking at the left side, you will see familiar names. So what we decided to do is we decided to divide our own repository so it supports the product feature-driven design. You see that we have the mobile accounts, we have mobile cards, mobile chat, which was not shown, mobile home, insights, investments, onboarding, payments, rewards, and servicings. So the good part about it is when we are adapting or creating a new feature, it's quite easy because what we can do is we can just use our CLI to spin up a completely new package with a set of dependencies already in place and with like all the linting config, etc. So it's actually really good for scalability. Now, in terms of what we have gained from this particular pattern, you can see that we have, firstly, the clearly established areas within the app. Secondly, the code ownership is much more predictable. So we have the code owners plugin. The code owners are assigned to particular packages, and when something changes in the package, they are completely aware of it and can approve or reject it. Also, it makes it easier to actually later on implement shared flows and things like this, because it is quite easy to understand where they are coming from and what they are used for. Now, we were speaking about the packages before and about our problem with 85 packages. What we decided to do is following pretty much the same pattern. So what we've done is we have created shared packages that are going to be prepared for relevant mobile packages. So you can see that we have the shared onboarding, shared payments, rewards, and servicing. Now, what we have decided to do is we have also decided to take out some of the helpers from the packages for like hooks, for screens, for components, etc., and ensure that they are only in the package that is actually going to use them. So let's say format UK phone number would not be in the helpers anymore, but instead of this would go to shared onboarding. That way we can make sure that, first of all, there are no cyclic dependencies when we import from mobile to shared, from shared to mobile, but also that it is easy to find. We have fewer packages, and we also have fewer relationships between packages. I think that one of the things that we have discovered in the meantime was that it is actually quite useful to assign the particular helper to a package, because all of the packages that are going to depend on it, like for example on format account number, so let's say it's the accounts, rewards, and payments. Well, they will need this particular shared helper anyways, so it actually makes sense that the dependency tree grows in that particular way. Now, what is next after we have done all of this splitting? The next thing to do is, of course, optimizing the CI/CD structure. So what we do when we have a really huge code base, we want to fail fast. The reason for that is, I think at one point for us, trying to run the unit tests was like 50 or 60 minutes on every PR. So not desirable, as you can imagine. So for us, what we decided to do is we, of course, try to shift everything left. So we have the checks locally with the Husky. But what we do as well is parallelizing all of the checks. So we obviously have the linting checks, type checks, unit tests, and detox. So if we can try to fail one of these, or maybe, well, if we happen to fail one of these, what's going to happen is all of the rest is going to get canceled. And obviously it saves us a lot of time, but also it saves us resources on the CI. Now, what would happen if we can fail even faster? So let's introduce the Turbo Cache from Turbo Repo. Now, with Turbo Repo, what's happening is every single time when we run a task, it is going to try to check first the hash in the Turbo Cache, and then when it's hit it's going to skip the particular task. And if it's a miss, it's just going to run it. Now, a good part about it is this is not only a local feature. I mean, yes, it does help locally, but Turbo Repo gives you the ability to also upload a remote cache, and that makes it easier for the PRs and for the release pipelines, etc. Now, it would be great if everything was so easy, but unfortunately, us being a bank, we are not necessarily able to just sign a contract very easily and use their solution. So we had to implement our own solution where we have our own remote cache in our own Bitbucket. And we also have a cron job that runs every 3 days to to clear all of the cache that is accumulated over the time. Now, speaking of all of this, there is one question in mind. I don't know if you know the specifics of React Native, but obviously, because it's an app, we always have to bundle everything together. So that means that even though we have split into micro frontends, in the end of the day, the bundle is just one, and it includes everything that is in the code base. Now, I think that some purists might say that, well, it is not micro frontends, but we think that it is. So why? But that's because we have introduced the chain sets. Now, chain sets allow us to either pin some of the packages that are not ready yet or that failed some of the testing, that are just not wanted in the main branch anymore, and we don't want to include them in the release. But in the same time, we can also bump the packages that are going to be included in the release. So what's happening is while we bump first of all, we are going to run a command that is going to create a changelog for all of the packages that changed. And then we can publish while we get all of our version upgraded. So as you can imagine, when we go through the dependency tree, it is, again, much more beneficial for us at the moment because the smaller dependency tree means less packages in the final release. So, sorry, I think that I spoke quite fast, so I ran out of my slides pretty fast, but that's all of it. Thank you. I think if you have any questions, maybe after the presentation that Philip is going to do, or...
Yeah, I mean, so far I didn't see any questions, but I of course have some questions. So first, I mean, yeah, I think totally microphones. The other thing is, I'm not sure if you could even, let's say, legally do that, because usually the app stores are quite restricted regarding side loading of things. So independent now of how React Native works, how you would have, let's say, a dynamic orchestrator there, etc. But if you would, let's say, get more code during runtime and integrate it, right, dynamically, either Apple or Google or both would come to you and your app would be thrown out of the App Store. I mean, maybe it wouldn't even enter when they realize it in their testing, right?
That's true.
That's always quite problematic, because the first micro-frontend solution I worked for now almost 7 years ago, it was also a hybrid application. And I mean, on the web, we made everything dynamic, but for the apps, we always bundled in and shipped it like that to the store. And so just with the next update of the app, a new configuration of, well, then side micro frontends was introduced, right? So it was always just with the app, you had always the snapshot, but on the web, it could be, let's say, a little bit more dynamic, and it could change from one day to the next. Whereas with the app, of course, I think there was a weekly or at least monthly cycle usually. And so that was one of the reasons, right?
Yeah, so just to add to that, obviously there are no technical issues for us to actually do that, because there are quite a few Webpack plugins that could just allow us to chunk the whole bundle into these specific packages. But as you said, the OTA is, it's just not happening. So unfortunately, yes, we still have to deliver one bundle, but we at least can decide what we want to release in it, whether we want to roll back. I mean, actually, I forgot to mention that rolling back or like fixing the bugs on the main branch, it's all like so much easier now that we have split everything in a more logical way. But yeah, definitely something to consider.
Okay, so we got one question from Kirill. Have you considered using Repack instead of the Metro bundler?
Yes, we have. I think that the reason why we haven't done it is it wasn't working well with the rest of our tooling.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the experience I had with React Native was that the Metro bundler can be quite. I mean, if you come from the web and you're used to know what. I mean, there you have, of course, all this, the variety of bundlers, and some are really, let's say, easy to use, but the more restrictive others are like Webpack. You need an engineering degree to just get started, but then you can do essentially everything. So then the Metro bundler feels a little bit like, it's quite simple, but once you want to customize it, but it's already tailored for it. So yeah, it just does its job. But you can either hate it or love it, I would say.
Mostly hated, but hey.
Mostly hate it. Yeah. Okay. So then there's one more question from Jesh. He asks, he's new to Micro Frontend UIs. He wonders if that could save him some cost in infrastructure.
Yes, definitely. I think that one of the main points that I mentioned before was actually the fully customizable CI/CD. So if we are going to cache, we are going to save a lot of resources. Essentially, the whole idea about failing fast is not only to help the developers, but also to save the resources on the CI/CD. So if we decide to divide things and use micro frontends, the faster we fail, the cheaper it gets.
So in general, you would say, I mean, with the modularization being all kinds of benefits, of course, come up, not only challenges. And one of the benefits is, of course, that now you think in these smaller terms, you require less resources to have them tested, have them deployed, and work with
Definitely.
them. Cool. Another thing that popped up in my mind, but you use essentially a monorepo, right? So
Yes.
all the shared packages are there, all your apps are there. So if I would be on your team now and I would work in one of these, I would still work in the one repository, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So, but there's one thing that we are using that actually supports the concept of the micro frontends. So we are currently using PNPM. And I know that Yarn also already introduced the concept of workspace, but with PNPM, we have two options, right? So we can either work with workspace, which means that we are always getting for a particular package the code that is the most recent in the main branch, or we can just pin the version, and that makes it actually easier for us to do the hotfixes and to try to, I don't know, do some mini beta releases and things like that.
Great. Okay, cool. Now I would say, since I don't see any more questions from the audience, I mean, we'll come back to that later. And I already mentioned the monorepo, which might be a good transition now to Philip, who has also something to share regarding monorepos versus microfrontends. And I think there was also a decision in that area, right? So, but I'm eager to hear now what Philip brings to the table regarding that.
Yes. First of all, thanks a lot, Sandra. A lot of your pain points you will find again in my presentation, so you're not the only one struggling. Also, in this whole process, I got awarded a degree in web ecology. So, yes, what you said, with you need to have studied Webpack to understand it, it's definitely right to a certain degree. All right. First of all, welcome everybody. I'm Philip from Netlight Consulting, and when I'm not playing drums or when I'm not, I gave it away. I'm also playing the drums when I'm not building front ends or perfecting my audio setup. And currently I work at VW Elli. Elli is part of the Volkswagen Group, and they have the mission to empower electric life. And that is actually also what the name stands for, electric life. They do provide wall boxes in order to achieve this mission, and also charging stations, and they also act as an energy provider in parts of Germany. They also offer a web shop to where you can buy these things, and they also offer a web application to manage your charging stations. The charging stations we're talking about are on the one hand wall boxes, and on the other hand is a 2.5 ton giant that is stacked with batteries. So you could in principle also put it into a festival area and just charge your cars there without needing the electricity grid, which is pretty amazing. The app that they're using, so what we're using to manage all of these charging stations is called the Alley Management Console. And so that you know what we're talking about, I've brought you a teeny tiny video. In the Alley Management Console, you can add a station. All the stations come with a pairing code. You can enter that pairing code, and then you can connect it. You can give all the stations a name so you can find them again. For example, like it's standing in the back office or it's standing in the Alley office in Munich. You can add them to groups. You can set permissions, so you can set them to private mode only or to public charging. You can set it, you can give it a location so that people who are using the Alley app can also find it on the map. And you can do a bunch of more things. You can also, so like all of the stations come with RFID cards, and you can pair these RFID cards. You can also take a look at some analytics. So here's just a few analytics. This video is about 1.5 years old at this point. There's a bunch of more analytics. And all of these things you can do in the management console. At Alley, I'm not just a front-end developer, I'm also a member of Team Tortellini. And if you've never seen what a tortellini looks like, here you go. All the teams at Alley have names of pastas, all the engineering teams, and Team Tortellini was essentially the team that created the management console about 3 years ago. Maybe even a bit more, maybe even 3.5 or 4 years. I joined that team 2 years ago. And right now our main involvement is partially with maintenance. So whenever updates roll around, we are the team to implement them. But we're also enabling teams. So if a team comes around and says, hello, I would like to do this and that, we are the team who says, okay, cool, we're going to plan that and we can try to help you with that. And apart from that, we also own a few microservices and a bit of business logic. I think we own 3 or 4 microservices at the moment, and also a bunch of business logic. So we are doing quite a few things. The Alley Management Console itself is also doing a few things. So I've already mentioned you can manage your charging stations there, but you can also do load management through the Alley Management Console. So if you've got 10 charging stations and you plug them all into the same wall adapter and then plug your cars in, and at some point your fuse is going to pop, and we'd like to avoid that, so we've got load management in place. You can also do card and access management so that not everyone can charge. We've got some cost and remuneration services, so if you do public charging, you want to get back some money. We've got usage analysis, so that's what I've already shown you essentially, but you can also obviously evaluate the data on your own, so you can download all the data or request them in a different format. And also customer care is using this website for a whole set of different use cases. And to handle all of these things, we came up with the concept of a portal. So on the top left, you've got our beautiful portal switcher, where you can switch between charging site management. So everything that is related to managing your charging stations on the site, or fleet charging. So if you've got 100 charging stations, you've got different needs and requirements than a person who's got only 3 charging stations. We've got charging at operations. We've got technical operations. We've got the enterprise portal that my team essentially owns. And we also have some developer tools. And then there is a few more portals where I don't have access permissions to. So there is a bunch of things going on in this. And all of that works fine. All of that is written with React and Redux. And that is all working nice. Let's start a bit with story time and ticket 66606. Someone last year, React released a new version, React 18, and React 18 and React 17 are in principle mainly compatible with each other. We wanted to upgrade someone in March last year, and we finished the upgrade in August. And it took at least 3 attempts to get there. So in the first attempt, we started to upgrade it, and after a day or so, we realized, okay, there's a bunch of transitive dependencies, or a bunch of dependencies in general, that rely on React and that just don't work anymore. So let's cancel it and let's do it someone else. That was the first attempt. The second attempt, we were like, okay, well, things are the way they are. Let's actually migrate the things we have to migrate. And after half a week or a week, we said, okay, nope, that's too much effort. Let's not do that. Let's push that. And on the first attempt, we finally pulled through. And the one dependency that had changed was our testing framework. And our testing framework decided to do a bunch of things very differently. Namely, all of our tests became async, so we had to rewrite all of our tests. And at Ellie, we're doing continuous integration and continuous deployment. So whenever you merge something into main, we will directly release it. And that means, in order to be sure that things are actually working, we have a lot of tests. And that means we had to rewrite a lot of code. The actual migration effort took about 2 weeks. And it was a lot of manual effort. And it was also a lot of repetitive manual effort. So there were days where I would just go, okay, select a piece of code, then switch to my keyboard, type async, switch back, and do that like 10, 50 more times per test file, and then go to the next test file. I got through 1.5 audiobooks, so that was nice. But in the end, I had physical pain in my shoulder, and that is really not the way it's supposed to be. And not gonna lie, I got pretty frustrated from that. But there was also not really a way to distribute the work between teams. So we had essentially just a monolith. And because we're doing because we're doing continuous integration, we have a lot of tests, and we cannot just merge, I don't know, with like 10 broken tests, because then we cannot release anymore. So we had to do everything at the same time, and distributing that to the teams was really difficult to just simply impossible. So we sat down with the teams or with my team, and we reflected a bit. And the first issue we had was, actually, we've got a lot of code. Back then we had, I think, 100,080 lines of code. That for us was already enough to make the migration take about 2 weeks. And the trend was that the lines of code were not growing linearly, but more like exponentially, because we were hiring new people, we were onboarding new teams, and all of that led to a curve that wasn't linear, but exponential. That scared us a bit. The other problem that we had was we only could have 1 version per dependency. If we could have had 2 versions of React or 2 versions of our testing framework, we could have just done that, right? So things would have just worked. That was a bit of a problem. But due to the way our setup was, we couldn't have that. Another thing was shared ownerships, or shared components without ownerships. So even if we had found a way to somewhat distribute the work to teams, I don't know, say opening a development branch, then making all the people upgrade their things in this development branch, in the end, there would have still been a bunch of components where nobody would have done anything. And in the end, my team would have had to migrate these components. But we wouldn't have known which components that were until the very end, because we don't know who owns which component, and in the worst case, if nobody feels responsible, we are responsible. So that whole process would have taken quite a lot of time. The next issue we had is test flakiness. We have had about, I think it was like 1,000 test suites or something like that. And if 0.5% of them is flaky, and it was less than that, that means that a bunch of your tests are going to fail frequently. And the pipeline ran for about 30 minutes, and that means If everything should work, it could just still fail, it could just still break, and you would still be annoyed. And then it wouldn't take you half an hour to release your code changes, but an hour. And also we had only one pipeline. So if we had multiple teams that are developing, and back then we had 7 teams who were working pretty actively on the console, and if all of them wanted to merge their changes, say right before the end of a sprint, things got pretty messy. And with the pipeline running half an hour, there is a certain theoretical limit of how many PRs we can merge per day. And that is not too many. There was like about 17 or something like that, if you take into consideration the typical working hours. So all of that was a bit of a problem. And also, last but not least, teams wanted to have more ownership and more independence. So we frequently had a bunch of teams who were like, hello, we'd like to change this and that thing in the test setup. And we were like, cool, you can do that. But if you do it, please also update these 400 other tests that you don't actually care about or own. And then we were like, yeah, okay, then let's maybe not do that. So we couldn't really give the teams ownership or independence with certain versions that we would use. And all of that was a bit of a problem. Then we started off exploring a few solutions. The first solution that we pretty much discarded, so the solutions we looked at were monorepos, micro frontends, and NPM packages. Think of the NPM package solution as your typical component library, right? So you publish them and you install them somewhere else again, and you just use them. That is a process I had used somewhere else, and that essentially didn't give teams more independence, but more dependence, because you would have to release a package and then you would have to create a PR in another team's repository and bump the version there. And that means instead of having one PR from your team, you would have to you would have 2 PRs, and one of them wouldn't have been to your team. That would have been annoying. So been there, done that, didn't want to do it again. The other solution were monorepos, and monorepos typically come with a fairly complex setup. So like very often the pipeline can become very difficult and hard to understand. And we also wanted to give people the flexibility to choose a different pipeline, to use a different pipeline setup, to play around with these settings. And that would have not really been possible if we went with a monorepo setup. So we said, okay, let's investigate micro frontends. And what we did is we started out to do a small, biggish POC. The POC phase we did took about 3 months. And we took this time to make sure that whatever we build is going to work. We wanted to make sure that all of the problems we could face, we would be able to overcome, that all of the challenges would be solvable, and that we wouldn't have to roll back at some point, because if you get the buy-in from every team and then roll back after a month because you're like, oopsie, we forgot about this problem, people will be mad, and they have a reason to be mad. So we took our time with this POC to make sure that everything would work. The setup we used was using single SPA and System.js. Single SPA allows you to split your code by URLs. So if you've got, I don't know, console LE echo / support, that would be one micro frontend, or / I don't know, charger / fleet charging, that would be another micro frontend, and so on and so forth. So the idea was essentially to make each of the portals we had one micro frontend. And System.js is essentially just a tool that allows you to dynamically load code. And we used that mainly for browser compatibility purposes. Nowadays, or in a year or two, you might want to use ES modules or something like that. But when we investigated that, the browser support for our relevant browsers, and mind you, we're living in a corporate world, did not support that. Also, System.js allows you to override dependencies, which came in very handy later. Using single SPA also allows you to use completely different tech stacks. So this is really the most amount of independence you can give to a team. So if a team wanted to use Angular the next day, they could just do it. If they wanted to use Vue, they could just do it. Because in the end, single SPA just requires you to expose an object with 3 or 4 methods. And as long as you keep this very small contract, everything is just going to work. So teams could use whatever they wanted and would have the maximum amount of freedom. And yes, this route-based code splitting really would have meant that CSM would be a portal, fleet charging at operations, TechOps portal, the enterprise portal, the developer tools. All of these things would have been their own micro frontend. So for the POC phase, we started to create essentially just a macro frontend. So we started with, or like actually before that, we built something that vaguely resembled the structure that we had. So that we were like, okay, let's build this in a day or two and just check out if it works in general, if we understand it, if we're happy with it. It looked fine, looked good. So we were like, okay, let's go with it. It was essentially just the sample code from single SPA and just modified to look a bit more like what we had and to behave a bit more like what we had in mind. And all of that worked fine. And then what we did is we just took the whole console and put it into a macro front end. That worked fine. And then we started to remove parts from it. So we started by removing a template portal, which is normally disabled, so you haven't seen it so far. And that one really just has a button on it and is connected to Redux. And removing that and making sure that Redux works was already quite a challenge, but we managed that in the end. And then we started to remove more parts from it, and then we're like, okay, this seems to work, that looks good. And then we wrote all of our findings down to a small migration guide, and we're like, okay, cool. Or like a very small informal migration, how did we do it guide. And I honestly forgot why I have this slide in here. Along the way, we've had a lot of learnings. One of the first learnings was we actually came back to using Webpack. So the project started out using Webpack, then we switched to Parcel, then we switched to Vite because it was just faster, and then we had to switch back to Webpack just because the way System.js is working, we couldn't keep up, but Webpack could. So we went full circle and went back to Webpack. And the first learning we had is that singletons are evil. If you've ever seen any lecture on software, people will probably have told you that singletons are an anti-pattern and you should avoid them. What is a singleton? Basically, if you've got a package and you've got two components, component A and B, and they use the same instance of the same thing, and there's supposed to be only one instance of this thing, then this thing is a singleton. That all works pretty well until you start to move things into 2 different packages. And that is exactly what we did. Because a singleton is only a singleton as long as it's in one package. And now we had 2 packages. So we had 2 instances of our singleton. And that means our singletons were no longer singletons. And one thing that is a singleton is a React context. And one thing that was using React contexts was our theming solution. So our theming solution was just broken. We used Material UI and we used some custom defined variables, and everything was just broken, everything was red, and we couldn't see anything. So that was our first white page of dev, and we're like, well, that's a roadblock. Yeah, this is one of the learnings. You've got to make sure you handle your singletons. The other learning we had was that dependency injection is great. So if you've got it's essentially a solution to this problem. So if you've got 2 packages, you essentially create your singleton outside of these 2 packages, and then you inject them in there. And please also acknowledge my fancy animations. That took me 10 minutes. And the nice thing is that System.js is essentially just a ginormous dependency injection container. So what you can do is you can say, I would like to not bundle this dependency, but I would like to externalize it. And then you essentially just say or tell System.js, if you ever come across this import specifier, please go to this URL, download this package, and then inject it into the package that's using it. And that is that was the solution to a lot of our problems. We've used dependency injection in at least 10 different ways, and that was really nice. The last thing we learned was that dependency or circular dependencies are difficult. And that is true. Like, we actually hit these roadblocks, or this roadblock, fairly late. But we hit this roadblock when we were testing things. So during our testing phase, things suddenly started to break. And I had to start reading the Jest, the code of Jest that loads your modules, and I can now tell you what it looks like. And I can also tell you that it looks very similar to the test or to the code that Webpack is using. Hence my degree in web ecology. I think I don't have to tell you anymore what a circular dependency looks like. We've already heard that from Sandra. So with all of these learnings in mind, we sat down and started to write a migration strategy. And this was somewhere in the beginning of December 2020. So about 3 months after we started with our POC phase. And the migration strategy really consisted of how do we get from our current status to our target status. And target status being all of these portals being split into a different micro frontend. And we're like, okay, let's just do it the way we did it, right? But then we realized there is a bunch of shared code. So we had already started to move some of the shared components to a shared domain or to a shared package. And we realized that it would continue to grow. So essentially, Ellie deals with charging stations. So in a lot of places, you are displaying information about charging stations, or you're fetching them, or you're just using them in one way or another. And all of these components, all of this logic was moved to our shared package. And that would in the end mean that all of the, or that a lot of the development would actually happen in our shared package. And we're like, that's pretty bad. Maybe let's not do that. And that was, in a way, our last learning. If you split along the wrong lines, you will probably make things worse and not better. So we had a plot twist. And this is the best image I found for plot twist. We wanted to split by domain boundaries and not by pages. Because in the end, we have a team that is very good at dealing with charging stations. We have a team that is very good in dealing with organizational data. And why not give these teams their own repository that just deals with these things? And that is exactly what we did. That also allowed us to remove single SPA as a dependency. Because we were no longer using it, we were no longer splitting across URLs, so we could also get rid of single SPA. But had the downside that we would now force everyone to use React. But then again, the company only hires React developers and the whole website is using React. So why would you introduce Vue? That would just make things worse, probably. Or at least less consistent. And the company is really diving deep on consistency. So that was not really a benefit we would ever use. But we could keep all the rest, and we also kept some of the old code as glue code. And the way it looked like in the end is everything in blue would be one micro front end. And so like everything in blue would be the organization micro front end. And the nice thing is it does not need to know anything about stations. But for stations, we're just using a component from the stations micro front end. And it's got the simplest, most possible contract. It's just got an ID, and it just renders the number 3, 5 or 0. And that way, with these very, very simple interfaces, we're trying to prevent breaking changes from happening, because they would be very annoying. But a lot of other things are micro frontend. So, for example, also this notification icon is a micro frontend. All the other menu entries are micro frontend or coming from a micro frontend. Just everything else is the glue code, and everything else is still living in our old big repository, which has gotten a lot smaller. So for the migration, the first thing we did is we essentially just locally refactored our code to introduce domains. And we just created a folder called domains, and in that created a folder called organization, and then we just started to drag all of the components from the organization domain in there, and all of that was just a local refactoring. So we could just, in the end, save it, commit it, publish it. Nothing has changed, just the structure. And we did all of that for the other teams as well. And that way, the teams could define their domain boundaries on the fly, and we didn't have to tell them how to split things. That was a really nice side effect, because each team really knows what they're usually working on, and that is usually their component. Sometimes, obviously, we still had to talk, because sometimes things were like, okay, is this a shared component, or should we maybe duplicate that, or does another team feel responsible for this? But all in all these things went very, very smooth. And we also enforced this rule of, or we asked teams to follow this rule of small interfaces, because in the end, if you make the interface too big, it's going to break at some point. At the end, we were thinking, well, now that we've got this new structure, it almost feels like a like a monorepo, because we actually also started to set up or to introduce a bunch of setup methods, so that in the end we could just take the code and put it into a different repository. So all of these things were really, really independent. They were already using some aliases to also seem like the imports were actually from a monorepo. And we were thinking about going the monorepo route, but we decided in terms of flexibility, in terms of independence, and in terms of pipeline times, that's still not the best choice. So we went with Micro Frontends nonetheless. To give you a small perspective on the time frame, this whole thing started in October 2020. In the beginning of December, we wrote the migration strategy, and we also got the buy-in from everyone else. So we made sure that everyone was in and everyone was following this. In January, my team extracted the first domains and essentially created templates for other teams to follow. During March and April, we asked the other teams to also extract their domains. And mid-April, we then actually did the split. And to show you a different timeline, this is lines of code versus time. And somewhere in April, right about here, something has happened. That is the time where we split the code. And honestly, the split in principle just worked. So we had 2 days of code freeze. We had 3 days where we did not deploy to production. But besides that, everything pretty much worked. There were some unexpected roadblockers. For example, one transitive dependency broke and all of the tests weren't working and all these things. But in general, it was just working. Since then, we had to address a few more problems. So for example, hot module reloading was at some point broken a bit. We also had to build a way to find references across all code bases, because now we didn't have one repository, but 17. So what we essentially ended up building was a small script that would clone all of the repositories, and then you could just use your IDE to find things in there again. Would also mangle the tsconfig files a bit so that everything looked like a monorepo, just like a Yarn workspace essentially. That was fun. We also built something that you could automatically inject your release candidate. So in the pipeline, you would get just a link, and you could click that link. That will take you to your website and automatically inject the thing you've just built, so you could just visually inspect what was going on. We had to control circular dependencies a bit. So sometimes it was just easy to change an import path or something like that. We also had to take care of the bundle size a bit. So it's a B2B application, so bundle size is not super critical, but also not completely irrelevant. So we're not going to lose any customers if they load the page for a second instead of half a second, but it's going to be unpleasant for them if they have to wait for 10 seconds or so before the first loading bar appears. So somewhere in the middle, we had to find our way, but also that worked out fairly well. Error logging became a bit more difficult. We didn't think of that, to be honest. But it turns out that we now don't have one version, but we've got 17 versions. So if you see an error, And you're like, well, this happened in console version ABCDEF. And we're like, cool, but like, which version of Micro Frontends was deployed? Because it's a method not found problem. Oops. So we had to take care that we also log all of these things. But in the end, things became a lot better. So we had also introduced browser tests along the line because that made things a bit more required. We had now a stronger ownership. Each repository has their own team that owns it. We've got more independent teams. All the teams can just do whatever they want, essentially. We've got faster release pipelines. So for the smallest domains, the time for the pipeline went down from 30 minutes to 3, which is quite an improvement. So we could easily deploy a lot of times the day. We could also release in parallel, which was super nice. All of that accumulated in a pretty good developer experience. Also, you've got less code that you've got to check out, so you'll find your way easier around. We've made manual testing easier with all these clicks in the CI pipeline, but you can just inspect things. The test flakiness was reduced, so we just have fewer tests, so fewer chances for flakiness, so more successful pipeline runs, which is great. And last but not least, we can now share maintenance burdens. And I'm already over time, so I'm going to cut it here. I was Philip, and if you want to find me on LinkedIn, there you go.
Great, thanks. All right, so far no questions in the chat, but as always, I have some questions. But Sandra, you might also have some question. If you do, just ask them.
Please go first.
Okay, all right. Okay, cool. Maybe let's start with this. How are the teams? I mean, they have their own repos, so one or more, right? Now, how do they start their micro front end? If they run this, would they then need to use some environment, or is it everything running locally? How is the experience compared to a mono repo? How different is it?
We essentially have a developer stage of the console, and what you can do is you can just start your application locally and then inject the local version into the build pipeline or into the productive website, essentially.
So you always need to be online for that, right? So
Yeah.
there is no offline strategy.
I mean, you could. So the thing is, you've got to be online all the time, anyways, because we're fetching a lot of data on that website.
But I mean, that you could mock, right? So
yeah, I mean,
or you should be able to do the mocking there.
We've been thinking about that, and if you wanted to, you could just clone all of the repositories and start them all in parallel. But then again, we are a company that relies on people being online, so we didn't treat that as a downside.
Okay. And I just asked you, right? Because, for instance, Pyro, the concept there with the emulator makes that possible already. You don't need a dedicated environment, because that you can, of course, what you said is obviously true. If you then need the real data, there's no way around getting online. But on the other hand, I mean, if you anyway use a mock, then why should you need to go online to, well, then just have the UI? But
we also don't have the mocks, so...
The mock data, you could just create some, but usually you don't have, right? In the beginning, at least. Okay, cool. Sandra, you go, because otherwise we have a question also from the chat.
Yeah, I'm actually waiting to answer the question on the chat.
Okay, it's one for PMPM, so I guess it is directed to you. But okay, so maybe we're anyway already in the public discussion. So I come back with another question to you, Philip. Maybe someone else in the question shows up. Then let's go with Kenneth's question here. Any sample repo with an advanced monorepo setup using PMPM and React Native? Do you know something?
Kenneth, I know that we have spoken at another event, and I promised to send over one of the examples, but I just didn't have the time to get on it because I'm a little bit overwhelmed with React Native upgrade. But I do promise that I am going to set up everything and send it over. I try to make it public as well, so I didn't post my GitHub, but it's just SM Jurek. It's not very exciting at the moment because obviously I work on a private project completely away from GitHub, and I just cross my fingers that one day we will make it back to GitHub, by the way. But yeah, just I have your email. I'm going to message you.
Oh, cool. But I think it would be really, really nice to have this request being answered, because I guess that especially the combination that is mentioned there, right? So not only monorepo but also for React Native using PNPM, I think that is a quite a cool thing. So
Yeah, so if I can one more time repeat, my handle on GitHub is smjurek, just like my first name, middle name, and last name, and I'll pop it over there.
Awesome. One other thing just from the audience, right? So Harris liked it. That was during your talk, Sandra, but I think also Philip did a really nice job. So that was
Thanks.
Quite well done. And I liked the plot twist. So that's why I also would have had some questions, because I mean, I'm also, of course, did use single spine, a couple of consulting projects. And very often that was not my choice, but we were brought to the scene when everything was already on fire. And one of the problems is with single SPA that is fully technically driven. And that's usually not what you want in micro frontends, because your boundaries are usually a lot more fluid, and it already starts with what you see on a screen, right? So things that come on a screen, I mean, it starts already with a menu, right? That is composed usually from different micro frontends, because if you now put all the information in, I mean, that's also sometimes advocated, right? I mean, I don't know if you've seen that, but very often people come, micro frontends, now I can have my header micro frontend. And I mean, there might be use cases for this, don't get me wrong, but usually if you cut it by business objectives, there can't be such a thing like a header micro frontend. If you would do that, then this one team would be always, grabbed by all the other teams that my link changed, or I want a different wording, or change my icon, or add me, I'm a new thing here, a new feature. I also need to be in the header. And that is just, a team that is always bombarded, right?
So, I mean, like we tried to start with, or we actually during our POC phase we used this approach, and we figured out that we were just moving more and more things into the shared repository, and in the end we have the feeling that it just wouldn't scale, and especially wouldn't solve the problems that we had, right? So we would have a lot of shared components, would have a lot of shared responsibility again. And one of our main objectives was to have a clear responsibility. And that would be very difficult. Or we would have, I don't know, like 85 different shared repositories, just to make sure that everyone has their own owner. But also that we were like, also that doesn't really feel like the way to go.
So I do have a question, actually. Like I mentioned that in our case, we are using the product feature-driven design, but also that we are going to run into the situations where we are going to have one, let's say, helper that is shared between multiple mobile apps, right? So in that case, we would also like to go towards elements of domain-driven design. And I wanted to ask, can you elaborate a little bit on how you decide what is a good domain unit? How do you get at that point?
Yeah. So during the initial split, these domain boundaries were mainly driven, or were in large parts driven by what felt good, to be honest. And since the domains very roughly also mirror our backend services, that was always a very good line, or a rough guideline of what could be a reasonable thing to split. So for example, we've got the organization domain and we've got an organization service, and essentially the idea also was a bit that all the data handling that happens for organizations, so fetching organization data, for example, would be handled in the organization domain, and anyone who wanted to use that would just then use the organization domain. And that way, also just by team responsibility, right? So if a team was like, well, this is clearly my responsibility and we only have one domain that we're dealing with, they would only have one domain. In my team, we ended up having a bunch of domains. So for example, the whole notification center we set up as its own domain, because we were like, well, it's going to be used in a bunch of places. So different stakeholders might want to put something in there. So that was also feeling like a good place to split a domain off. And in the end, we also said we can always make a domain smaller if it becomes too big, and just split it into subdomains, for example. So there's like no limit as to how small we can make it. But we started off with rather biggish chunks.
Great, thank you.
That's a good strategy, to be honest. I mean, I usually give also this recommendation, right? So first, put it somewhere where it logically would see it. If you really don't find anything, and then there is no existing team, then you might start something new there. But I mean, if otherwise you think, well, right now it belongs in this bucket, just put it there, because you can always put it out, right? And I mean, if you don't find something, what you can also do, you can just start with it in the app shell. So just an example from previous projects, there was a notification feature. So nothing really. So you would say that's like a shared feature of the whole application. That's not something that now forms a real subdomain or so. So let's put it in the app shell, and it stayed there for a while, let's say half a year or so, and because everyone got it. But then suddenly, from one day to the next, product owners decided to put more emphasis on this, and so they changed the requirements for that, let's say, nearly on a daily basis, right? So you had suddenly this thing to be deployed, and of course you don't want to deploy your app shell quite often. That's usually a thing that doesn't come with some domain functionality, and you want to have this just updated once in a while, right? And therefore, after the third or fourth update, we said, well, that now belongs in the new Micro Frontend dedicated for this, just because its life cycle is moving at the moment so fast. So it really belongs somewhere new, and all the other microphones, it just deal with some business aspects. And this thing, it just forms a new logical unit. But that you didn't decide on the fly. So therefore, I fully agree. Need to have a little bit of a feeling. There are no right. I mean, there are some wrong answers here, but no one can. I mean, most of the things that are out there, you can always argue and find a line there. As long as you're consistent, it's fine. And I think consistency is really key. If you make a new component, where you put it in, you should put it into the microphone that it forms a consistent unit. I always say, if you just shut that microphone off, would then still be fragments of that feature be somewhere else, or is it completely gone, right? So that's, in my opinion, always the litmus test where you can see, does that form a good unit, like with microservices? Can I just shut it down and the whole system still works up to a degree where, say, that just that one feature is removed, that's something.
Yeah, totally agree. Also during the migration phase, where we're just doing refactorings, we also wrote our own custom scripts that would analyze which micro frontends would depend on something else, just to make sure that we were not going crazy and that we were not doing ridiculous things there. And also one of the things we wanted to avoid was that essentially anyone would use the app shell itself, but like rather some shared repository, because otherwise we would have ended up in circular dependency hell between packages. And that was the one thing we really wanted to avoid.
Yeah.
Music to my ears. Oh, sorry. I was just saying, music to my ears. Like, I think that after spending 3 months trying to catch up with the code base and resolve all the cycles in our code base, I honestly, every time somebody speaks about resolving cycles, I just get very oddly excited.
Yeah, I feel you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, quite often, I mean, coming to that point where both of you now are, I think is, of course, not easy, because you need to have the right setup, and that, of course, involves some experimentation and finding out what works best for the problem or project at hand. But then once you reach that point, I think you are at more or less a zen state, right? So, of course, now you have either a lot of different subdirectories in your monorepo, or you have now a lot of different repositories, but it drives you in a direction where you now make really smaller things, and you have a feeling that, I mean, these things are manageable suddenly, right? So if you get into a subdomain now, maybe now just a directory or a different repository, it's always manageable, right? And much easier to comprehend than before in the big monolith, right?
Yeah, I think for us the biggest benefit is obviously we want to challenge banks like Starling, Monzo, etc. Right? So for us, if the product team comes up with something new, we really want to get on it right away. We don't really want to wait 3 months until somebody decides something. So we don't really have the prep time. And it's amazing how now at the moment we can just run one command, spin a whole completely new package, and just make it work.
Okay, maybe one more technical question for Philip. So you removed singles SPA, but I guess System.js is still there and still the module loader, right?
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
how is the orchestration happening? Is the list of micro frontends essentially a static list like the import map, or is it dynamically resolved from a server, or how is that looking like?
So for the beginning, we said let's keep it as simple as we can. And we've just decided that everything is just a static list. So there's just a list of like 16 entries per domain and then a few shared dependencies. So things like React or Material UI. And all of the dependencies just resolve to /latest. So we just put everything into a few buckets. On the one hand, split by version, and on the other hand we also throw everything into a latest bucket, and that way once something is released it gets moved from a release candidate to the version bucket and then also to the latest bucket, and if you then refresh the page you just take the latest version.
Okay.
But we also said, like, if we realize that things become more difficult, we could very easily spin up a small microservice or a small cloud function or whatever that would just take care of assembling this import list. But for the time being, we didn't have the need to do that. And we said, let's just keep it as simple as we can because it is already somewhat complex.
Yeah. On the other hand, though, I mean, we always recommend, of course, a discovery service because it allows two things. On the one hand, you can cache these things much better, right? So there's not even a request necessary to just find out that whatever leads to latest hasn't changed, right? And it just returns the appropriate e-tag or whatever. You don't even need to do that because the URL you can send back, you can cache this indefinitely to the browser, right? If you get unique URLs. So no need to ping for all these resources. And the other thing is, of course, you can compose your solution dynamically, which means you could have, you said that, for instance, customer care is in there and they have a completely different set of functionality. So what if you log in and whatever, privileges you have, you just get the micro frontends that contain also these things, and you don't get any other code which you wouldn't be able to execute anyway because the backend doesn't let you do something. So you could spare all these checks in the front end suddenly because that's already handled on the orchestration level. You don't even get what you can't use, right? And,
totally agreed.
So therefore, we always recommend it. It's just a good way where two things come together. So you don't only have the developer productivity and all that, but suddenly also you can make your customers happy.
But that's the thing. It's in the end a B2B application, and users log in maybe once or twice a month, if at all. Yeah. And so the normal users, they wouldn't even notice. So also the assumption, or what we've seen, is that users have not the latest laptops, old browsers, and all these things. So performance, so like this sounds really crude, but very to a certain degree is used to having slow websites, and optimizing for speed is useful to a certain degree. But we decided that in this case, we didn't need it. But that is something I would never ever do if it was a B2C application, for example. Then I would never ever do that because you might lose customers, and then nope.
That's a nice thing about B2B, right? So they are happy that something works for something is there at all, right? So we're laughing, but B2C is everyone, I paid nothing for this, but I demand everything. And B2B is like I pay thousands of euros and I'm happy that it works at all, right? So it's somewhat, I always found that quite, so that's the beauty of working in a B2B environment, I think.
I mean, like the only thing that has changed is that it loads, I think, 0.5 MB or 1 MB more of data. And that is a reasonable amount, I'd say. So it doesn't take forever. It's not degraded that much. It has degraded a bit, that is true, but it didn't degrade that much. So I'm using that thing on a daily basis, and I'm honestly not annoyed.
Cool. Great. All right. So since we don't have any more questions in the chat, something to finish our discussion round. Maybe let's make two questions. Let's start with the first one. That's biggest regrets regarding the project, or what would you change if you would go back? And you can't say a plot twist, Philip. So, so something where you say, oh, maybe it was more time, or I don't know, reflecting what would have changed, and what are the key advantages that you now see besides maybe the ones that you mentioned in the talk? So maybe let's start with Sandra.
Yeah, I for one, if I could meet myself from, let's say, 4 years ago, I would have told myself, never try to sort the functionalities just by the type, because it will never work. Everything, the only thing that is going to bring is a lot of grief. So definitely from the get-go, I would just try to support either the product feature driven design or like this combined with the domain driven design. Otherwise, I can only imagine what I could have done when, if I wasn't resolving all of this stuff.
Okay, and biggest benefits that you see now of the solution, besides the ones that you mentioned, independence of teams, etc.?
I think that definitely the time that we spent on the PR builds, because there used to be a moment where obviously we wanted to run some, I don't say all of the detox tests, because finally we are on the level where we run only for the functionalities that have changed, etc. So it's already much faster, but keeping in mind how long it used to take just to run all the unit tests and then all the detox tests and then just verify everything. I think that it's definitely the benefit is definitely with the development time, the actual, because obviously, regardless of whether your laptop is strong or not, the moment when you have to, run a whole code base full of unit tests, it does start to sound very funny and it gets pretty hot. So because of that, we decided that, we forgive the no verify. It's like if people want to run the test on the CI, just let them do it. But this is why we benefit so much from the fact that I'll say my two favorite words for today, but from the fact that we essentially fail fast.
Awesome. Now for you, Philip, what do you regret?
I think the biggest regret is I've mentioned this hot module reloading as an additional improvement, and it turned out that we just didn't set one flag. So it was a 4-line code change, and if we had just read the documentation, we would have noticed. So the thing I somewhat regret is not reading all of the documentation of the things that we've been using. Sounds very trivial.
It's always like that, right? So
yeah.
Quite often the thing you search is in front of you, but I mean, if you would have known that, you wouldn't have started the search. So
like all of the documentation, we're essentially just writing to tell people if you've got a question, it's in the README. Because we're not expecting that everyone reads it, but we're like, it's just documented, just read it. And apparently we're also a victim
Guilty.
of this. Yeah.
It's the usual cycle, right? You go to somewhere and say, how does it work? Then they tell you, then they say, that should be documented. Then they tell you it is documented. Then you're like, oh, I didn't read it.
Exactly.
So that's usually, but they are not writing the documentation with the expectation that you read it. They're just, usually documentation is written to be, let's say, in defense against that, well, you should document that. Then it turns out it wasn't read.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest improvement that I see is the developer experience in general has improved. So, for example, I'm finally able to run all the tests in a domain. I just wasn't able to do it. Like some tests would randomly hang because one of the node threads died or whatever. And I can finally run them all in a reasonable amount of time. And also pipelines are faster. So like I don't have to wait for half an hour to see if, I don't know, some test has worked. I can just see it in 3 minutes and be like, okay, cool, everything's good. So even if I don't run everything locally, I can just push it and I get a very quick response. And that is like
Awesome.
in general the developer experience. That was one of the main goals that we had. And yeah, that's the biggest improvement I see.
It's also a great transition for now this final question. And I think we had this question rounds before and we always agreed on that. So following statement, would you say the solution overall is more complicated, but working with it is a lot simpler than beforehand once micro frontends are introduced?
Yes, as long as they work.
Yes.
But if something breaks, it gets...
Then we go
slightly
back
more
that the solution is
Exactly.
complex,
So if
right?
if you suddenly see, hello, this method is not defined, and you're like, well, it's clearly there, and then you suddenly find yourself reading the module loader of Webpack, that's the point where it gets more complicated. Before that, it's easier.
Or when you suddenly need to, trace back why a thing isn't there, and you find out it's a singleton that's now, of course, living once there and living once here. And just because it was set there doesn't mean it's set here, right? So
Yes.
When
the
I
React
was
dispatcher is one of these singletons, like the context you mentioned, but the dispatcher also. Yes, Sandra.
when I was listening to you speaking about singletons, I actually had in mind one of the battles that we had. So essentially, React Native spins up an instance of a native component, and there can only be one instance of the component. So obviously, you get the gist. It's the moment when, so there is an issue with PNPM where sometimes when a package doesn't find like a peer dependency, then it's just going to add additional instance. So we would always end up with two instances of React Native. And we had to do like a lot of custom magic in the common.js file for PNPM just to get it removed, check for the cycles and everything. So yeah, definitely. When you said that you felt my pain, I felt yours as well.
Yeah, I can agree. Awesome. Cool. It was a pleasant round. We stop on time since I don't see any more questions in the chat. It was quite quiet today, but doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So
maybe we just explained everything very well. That's what I will believe in.
And I mean, don't forget, so many of our viewers are not in, let's say, a good time zone. So the video will be watched later, and maybe one or the other person will write a comment on YouTube or will directly message you on LinkedIn or one of your other channels. In general, thanks a lot for being here. It was a pleasure.
Thanks
really,
for inviting
nice
us.
presentations.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, and then hear you soon.
Yeah, you too. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.